Zeenat fell in love with a man from a different ethnic group, but her mother was determined to arrange a marriage for her within the same group to restore the family's honor. Zeenat and Hassan continued to see each other in secret but were discovered and faced the harsh consequences of breaking tradition. Zeenat was violently beaten, forbidden from seeing Hassan, and eventually burned alive by her mother. Her husband, Hassan, fought for justice and helped convict Zeenat's executioners. The incidence of honor killings of women in Pakistan is distressingly high, and despite this, the government's response has been inconsistent. Zeenat's mother was sentenced to death, and her brother received a life sentence in prison. Zeenat, 18 years old, and Hassan, 20 years old, were young Pakistanis who knew each other since college. They were in a relationship, hoping to get married and love each other deeply. Unfortunately for them, they did not belong to the same ethnic group. She was Punjabi and he was not. This story could have been a fairy tale, but that was not the case, especially in some countries where arranged marriages are widespread. It is sometimes impossible to be with the one you love. Zeenat and Hassan will learn this the hard way, and despite their love, they will pay a high price for the weight of traditions. Zeenat Rafiq was a Pakistani girl born in 1988. She belonged to the largest ethnic community in the country, the Punjabi, who represent nearly half of the Pakistani population. Although her family is not the poorest, they still live in a certain state of precariousness. They live in one of the poorest neighborhoods of Lahore, which is the second largest city in the country and the capital of the Punjab province. It is an important economic and tourist center with beautiful monuments and mosques. However, like throughout the country, there are also much poorer areas where families struggle daily to live decently. Zeenat's family is part of this. Her mother Parvine had been a widow for a few years, and although life was not easy, she was well surrounded by her family, who were very supportive. Unfortunately, in recent years, Parvine had seen her two elder daughters get married without her consent, which had tarnished the family's honor. Determined not to make the same mistakes with Zeenat, Parvine was less indulgent and decided that she would choose her daughter's husband herself. She wanted him to be from a good family and have a good social status so that she could restore her family's honor. Zeenat, when she was little, was a mischievous and lively child. As she grew up, she developed a passion for poetry and loved music. She would spend hours writing poems. Coming from a very religious and traditional family, Zeenat was brought up in the Islamic faith. She was very devout and had learned the entire Quran by heart. She spent a lot of her free time teaching the Quran to the children of her neighborhood. She was very kind and helpful, and everyone liked her. However, not everything was rosy in her life. Zeenat knew that she was destined to marry someone she did not choose. She was a woman and had no say in the matter. She knew her fate and had to comply with traditions. However, her heart was already taken. She was in love with one of her neighbors, Hassan. They first met in school when she was 12 years old, and they hit it off immediately. There was a kind of chemistry between the two teenagers that quickly made them inseparable. The fact that they lived 2 blocks apart only reinforced this bond. At first, it was just a friendly relationship, but gradually, it grew closer until they didn't want to be apart anymore and confessed their respective feelings. However, Zeenat knew the danger of such a relationship. She knew that her mother and older brothers would never accept Hassan as one of their own, and she also knew the consequences that could arise from such a relationship. Hundreds of Pakistani women die every year at the hands of their relatives for so-called honor crimes. Zeenat was well aware of this and feared that something might happen to her or her lover, especially since her older sisters had been fortunate enough to choose their husbands and have a love marriage. Zeenat's mother Parvine constantly dwelled on and regretted not being able to save the family's honor. She no longer had a husband and was determined to maintain her family's reputation and honor within the Punjabi community. She had vowed not to make the same mistake with Zeenat and was planning to arrange a marriage for her with a man from the same Punjabi ethnic group with a high social status and a good situation. This marriage was more than just a union, it was an opportunity to elevate the entire family socially. Zin was a highly sought-after young woman, but her heart belonged only to Hassan. The two lovebirds were careful to keep their love hidden away from prying eyes. But unfortunately, one day the girl's family discovered this relationship, and after violently beating her, her mother formally forbade her from seeing him again. All of her hopes were on the verge of collapsing. Parvine absolutely wanted her daughter to marry a man from a high social level. Hassan was not only a mechanic, but also from a minority ethnicity in Pakistan. Although inter-community marriages exist, they are very rare in Pakistan, and communities mix very little. For the mother, it was simply unthinkable that her daughter could marry this young man. She would never allow it. However, Zeenat had her own character and did not accept the situation, which caused tension between the two women. When tensions grew too high, the young woman was beaten not only by her mother but also by her older brothers who shared the same view as their mother. Hassan was aware of the violence that Zeenat was subjected to by her family, but he couldn't intervene. He wasn't from the same clan and he wasn't married yet, so he couldn't do anything. He formally asked for Zeenat's hand in marriage several times, but Parvine refused each time. Zeenat was desperate and found it unfair, especially since she had no support from her family. Her two older sisters who had married men they had chosen took their mother's side and criticized Zeenat for her deviation from their mother. Fate was cruel to Zeenat and Hassan, as they were living an impossible love story due to their different ethnicities, but they were far from imagining what awaited them. One day in May 2016, Zeenat showed up panicked and covered in blood at the Hassan family's home. The violence had escalated, and her mother had just beaten her so severely that she had a broken nose and mouth. The day before, one of her brothers had also hit her so hard that she had to be hospitalized and required stitches. Seeing his beloved in such a state, Hassan felt a deep anger rise within him. He wanted to confront Zeenat's brother, but his family advised him against it, as he was not yet married and any retaliation could backfire on him. Frustrated, Hassan could not bear to see Zeenat suffer any longer, and the couple decided to get married, regardless of what Zeenat's family thought. After this incident, Zeenat returned home, and the couple began to take steps to make their union official, carefully concealing their actions from Zeenat's family. Some time later, Zeenat and Hassan got married civilly, and the young woman left her family home to live with her husband's family. For Parvine and her children, it was a real shock, a terrible betrayal. The mother was very angry with her youngest daughter, who had once again, in her opinion, tarnished the family's honor. To make matters worse, Zeenat's departure aroused the curiosity of the neighborhood, and rumors began to spread. In a very short time, everyone in the neighborhood knew that young Zeenat had married without her mother's consent to a young Pashtun man of very low social status. After the first two daughters, the youngest, Zeenat, had once again brought disgrace upon the whole family. The entire neighborhood knew about this secret marriage, and rumors were spreading like wildfire. Hassan and Zeenat were now married and living under the same roof, but Zeenat knew her mother and brothers well. She was terrified and found it hard to believe that they would let it go. She felt deep down that it was not over. Hassan, for his part, tried to find the right words to reassure his wife. He told her that, from now on, he was her husband and that he would never allow anything to happen to her. Despite her fear, Zeenat was still hopeful. She was no longer alone and had her husband and his whole family supporting her. 3 days after their daughter's departure, Parvine arrived with her brother and sister at Hassan's parents' house. They asked to talk to their daughter. Zeenat, although frightened, agreed to talk to her. She was very surprised when Parvine told her that she accepted the marriage, but begged her to come back home for 8 days to follow local traditions and prepare for the wedding. Seeing how terrified Zeenat was, Parvine insisted, telling her that it was the only way to restore the family's honor, especially since all the neighbors were talking and criticizing her departure. However, Zeenat was very afraid. She knew her mother, her brothers, the history of her family, and, above all, she knew the sanctions reserved for women who did not respect traditions and family rules. In Pakistan, hundreds of women are executed every year by their relatives in honor killings, and Zeenat knew this all too well. The mothers of the young newlyweds spoke to each other, but Hassan's mother was also afraid that something would happen to her daughter-in-law and was not too keen to send her back to her family. That's when Parvine's brother, Zeenat's uncle, spoke up and pledged to ensure the young bride's safety. He promised them that everything would go well and that he would personally take care of it. Moreover, what convinced Hassan's family was that the elders were informed and had approved the request of Parvine's family. After all these arguments, Hassan's family agreed that Zeenat should return to her mother's for 8 days to prepare for the wedding and restore the family's honor. Unfortunately, this decision would be fatal for her. Zeenat, 3 days after getting married and leaving home, found herself back in this family prison. The first few days went relatively well. Her mother seemed to be busy with wedding preparations while Zeenat spent her time locked up at home writing poems to her beloved. During these 8 days, she was not allowed to contact her husband, but she still secretly called him to give him updates. Hassan was reassured that everything seemed to be going well. Unfortunately, they did not know that it was the last time he would hear his wife's voice. On June 8, 2016, the day seemed to be a normal day in the popular streets of Lahore. The sun was shining, and nothing suggested the tragedy that was about to unfold. Suddenly, Zeenat's screams shattered the tranquility of the neighborhood. Parvin and one of her sons, Anis, had ferociously attacked her. He had beaten her repeatedly and tied her to a bed on the terrace of their roof. The young girl cried, pleaded, and begged them to stop, but in vain. These two tormentors were not going to stop, and it was certainly not her supplications that would make them stop. After receiving numerous blows and being strangled, the young girl lost consciousness. It was at that moment that her mother poured several bottles of gasoline on her daughter. Once the bed and the poor young woman were covered in gasoline, Parvine, determined, cracked a match and threw it on her daughter. Zeenat immediately caught fire, and horror was unleashed. The screams of the tortured one and then the smoke did not take long to alert the neighbors, who immediately contacted the emergency services. A few minutes later, the police, firefighters, and some neighbors who came to help were already on the scene, and they were surprised when they arrived at the house to see Parvine. the mother of the family, in the street, beating her chest and proudly shouting that she had finally restored her family's honor. She claimed to have killed her daughter to protect her family from dishonor and misfortune. On the fourth day, Hassan received a desperate call from his wife asking him to come and get her immediately. She was in tears and extremely anxious. Hassan tried to understand what was going on, and Zeenat told him that since morning, the atmosphere had become tense again. Her mother was once again reproaching, insulting, and threatening her. The newlywed on the phone begged her husband to come and get her. Hassan's heart was torn, but he tried to reassure her, reminding her that the elders were aware of what she had done and that she had already done the hardest part. He told her that she didn't have much time left before they could finally be together and live happily and freely. The firefighters rushed to the roof terrace and tragically could only confirm the death of the young bride. The police immediately arrested Parvine, who continued to scream that she had killed her daughter to establish her family's honor. In the midst of this commotion, Parvine's son, who was an accomplice in the crime, took advantage of the chaos to flee the scene. The police wasted no time and immediately launched a search team. The news quickly spread, and Hassan's family rushed to the scene of the tragedy, but it was too late. Zeenat's body was no longer there, it had just been transported to the morgue for an autopsy. Hassan was in tears and totally in shock. Afterward, he and his family went to the morgue to identify his deceased wife's body. Once again, this terrible ordeal traumatized the young man even more. During this time, the neighborhood residents had gathered in front of the house of the tragedy. Many were affected, and the inhabitants commented on yet another crime supposedly committed for honor. Zeenat's uncle, the man she was entrusted to him, was also present, and when he was questioned by the local media, he revealed that her sister had sworn to her long ago that none of her children would marry a Pashtun. For him, this tragedy was predestined. Chazia, one of Zeenat's sisters who had been fortunate enough to have the marriage she wanted, did not hesitate for a moment to hold her little sister, who had just died, responsible. She indicated that she should never have to fight their mother in such a way. Then she talked about her, telling that she had thought about her mother's suggestion to break ties with Zeenat. She finished by saying that she never wished for her little sister's death. Meanwhile, the police were still searching for Anis. Parvin was taken to the police station where she once again claimed responsibility for her daughter's murder. A few days later, Anis was finally caught. Forensic medical analysis revealed that there were traces of smoke in Zeenat's respiratory system, indicating that she was still alive when she was burned. The youngest in the family had been tortured in her final moments, which must have been a real ordeal. Her family did not claim her body, so Hassan's family took care of the remains of the poor young woman. After this tragedy, Hassan fell into a deep depression beyond the sadness that tore his heart. He blamed himself for not coming to pick her up during her last call. For days, he had many nightmares and anxiety attacks, but he could not let himself be defeated. Justice had to be done. He knew that in Pakistan, where hundreds of women die each year in so-called honor crimes, justice is rarely served. Therefore, with the support of his family, he fought a real battle to have his wife's executioners convicted. He knew that he alone could lead his fight because his wife's entire family had disowned her. Zeenat was not the only victim of this scourge in the Punjab region that year, in 2016. A few days before her, Maria Sadaka, a 19-year-old woman, had been lynched and burned alive by villagers because she had refused to accept the marriage proposal of a man who was already married and twice her age, the owner of the school where she taught. In April of the same year, a 16-year-old girl was also murdered for allegedly helping another couple to elope. The police stated that Cambridge Riyazat had been drugged, suffocated, and placed in the back of a van that was then set on fire. The case of poor Zeenat sparked the interest of Shahbaz Sharif, the Chief Minister of Punjab. In February 2016, Shahbaz's brother, Nawaz Sharif, the former Prime Minister of Pakistan, pledged to fill a gap in Pakistani Islamic law that allows many honor crime perpetrators to be released because, although these honor crimes are punishable by law, in reality, they are rarely prosecuted. Under current laws, members of the victims' families can usually forgive their daughter's killers for an average sum of around 1,000 euros, and these forgiveness deals mean the end of all legal proceedings, so the criminals often go unpunished. Nearly 1,000 women die each year in honor killings by relatives in Pakistan, but many other cases go unreported. The Punjab province, where many attacks on women have taken place, had adopted a law criminalizing all forms of violence against women a few months before Zeenat's death. However, more than 30 conservative religious leaders in all major Islamic political parties in the country had threatened to hold demonstrations if this law was not repealed. The government then proposed to legalize husbands' right to beat their wives lightly. The extremist religious groups integrated campaigns for women's rights with the promotion of obscenity. They said that this Punjab law would increase divorce cases and destroy the country's traditional family system. Parvin was sentenced to death at her trial, and her son Anis, who was caught shortly after, was sentenced to life in prison. Thank you for listening, and don't forget to follow for more crime stories.